Hello, lovelies, and welcome back to this little adjunct to the Fluff and Hammer. I've been having a right go. I've been having a right look through my Drukhari and Dark Elder books recently. I've got them all. The Drukhari books, or rather the Dark Elder as they once were. The original book came out at the advent of Third Ed. The Dark Elder was sort of the poster child antagonists for Third Ed because they were newly created. They were newly created for that release, and that was a titanic shift from second ed to third ed. It's arguably one of the biggest changes Warhammer 40,000 has ever gone through. The whole game system changed. The only comparable shift in recent years was from 7th to 8th ed, which completely overhauled the whole system, you know? Introducing new standard stats and that kind of thing. And way back then, the Dark Elder, as they were, there was no mention of Drukhari back then. The Dark Elder were just a very different thing. They were a very different thing. They were much more bland. They were much more kind of... They were only just finding their feet with the army. It wasn't really as fleshed out as it could be. And as a result, it was a little bit dull. A lot of the units hadn't really gotten their background sorted yet. And they were a little bit boring, I'll be honest. They didn't really fare very well back then. And one of the units that wasn't really anything to speak of, to be honest, in terms of its background and its ethos, were the Scourges. The Scourges were, back then, just the standard jump pack unit for the Dark Elder. They weren't like the genetically altered, surgically enhanced monsters they are now. They were just Dark Elder in suits that had backpacks that flew. That was it. The only real thing that distinguished them was the fact that they were an odd jump pack unit in that they carried heavy weapons, which was very, very odd at the time. Jump pack units back then tended to be assault-based, so it was things like your Raptors for Chaos Space Marines, who also made their debut at that point, by the way. It was things like your assault units for Imperial Space Marines, and so on and so forth. But the Scourges were kind of boring in terms of their background. They were literally just Dark Elder in suits, and that was pretty much it. You didn't really hear much else about them. Now, like all of the units, when the 4th ed, it was the 5th ed Dark Elder Codex came out, when the whole army and range was reimagined and totally redesigned by Phil Kelly, and every unit got a real shot in the arm when it came to their background, their politics, the way they worked in context with Comora and its cultures. The Scourges were just totally reimagined from the ground up, totally reimagined. They became something very, very particular. Rather than just being Dark Elder in suits, they became Dark Elder who had sold themselves to the homunculi, and they had sold themselves with reference to a very particular form of transformation. And it's described in detail in that codex and in all the Dark Elder Drukhari codexes that have come after. Their bones are hollowed out, their bodies are drilled open, they are genetically and surgically transformed, new limbs are grafted on their backs that eventually grow into wings. There are new muscle stimulants pumped around their bodies. They become different. They become ascended from other Drukhari, from other Dark Eldar, and they regard themselves as such. They are very, very unusual. The Scourges are held in very, very high regard in Comora society because they are a set apart. They don't belong to the Cabals. They don't belong to the Covens. They don't belong to the witch cults. They are their own power and their own entity, and they are absolutely ubiquitous within the Dark City. They occupy these odd eyries in the higher spires of Comora, and they even talk differently by all accounts. They move and talk differently. They move in this very exaggerated, theatrical, bird-like way. They've literally become other creatures. They're predators now. And like other Drukhari, they feed on pain and suffering and anguish, but they prey on the streets of Comora. They swoop down and pluck up other Drukhari or, other entities, alien entities that have become lost in the labyrinths of Comora, and they impale them on the higher spires and torment them. That's how they operate. But they also do something very peculiar in that they act as the Dark City's communications network. I mean, there are other forms of communication in the Dark City, obviously, with their advanced technology and whatnot, but they prefer to utilize the Scourges. The Scourges act as messengers between the different cabals, the different power bases. They carry gifts and messages and so on and so forth between the different city-states and factions and whatever, and they demand a very high price for it, a very high price for it. As a result, they become ubiquitous, and to slay a Scourge, to actually offend the Scourge flocks, is an invitation to reprisal. They're very much like the Mandrakes, you know. They are a caste apart from the other Dark Elder. Not many survive it. Not many survive the actual operation to turn them into Scourges, and even those that do have to prove themselves. When they first awaken, they are let loose from the laboratories of Lower Comera. They have to soar up amongst the flocks, and they have to survive up there. They have to make their presence felt, as it were, and they have to make the other Scourges realise that they're worthy of joining the flocks. If they don't, then they're torn apart. So they may have spent, apparently only like nobles, only those who are able to afford the soul tithe can afford to become Scourges, because they are an elite. They consider themselves literally and spiritually above the rest of Comera. They are very protective of their surgically altered bodies. They don't like to put them in harm's way. So to command a flock of Scourges to accompany you, for example, into real space, then you need to be an Archon or a Homunculi or a Succubus of some renown and of some influence. Otherwise, they just won't bother. They'll probably take it as an insult, and they'll probably attack you and kill you. They're very interesting. This is something they've done with practically all of the entities and units within the Drukhari and the Dark Elder. They've made them something more. They've made them interesting. And the Scourges are one of my favourites. Not only is the background now beautiful for them, I love the status, and I love the fact that they're surgically altered, so they are physically different. They're not just Dark Elder in suits. They have been physically and surgically altered to be some other measure of entity. The models are gorgeous. The models were released in conjunction with the 5th Ed Codex, and they still stand up really well. They were one of the newer breed of plastic kits from that era that were really dynamic, and as suits the Scourges, because they swoop and flock and soar all over the place. They are absolutely beautiful, and they've got different like mutations and varieties amongst them. So you've got Scourges that have got bat-like wings. Some of them have got feathered wings. So they have this sort of fallen angel thing about them. I've got a thing about humanoid entities that have got wings. I think it's a beautiful aesthetic. So the Scourges really do it for me. The fact that they're also very lithe and very sort of athletic looking, I love that. I love that to bits. In terms of how they function on the battlefield, they're actually pretty brilliant. They're pretty brilliant. They're one of my favourite heavy weapons units in the game at the moment, because they're one of the most mobile. It's very, very weird to have heavy weapons units that can fly, that can ignore terrain, that can move that fast. You can position them in more or less the perfect place to get the shots off that you need, and they can carry an amazing array of weaponry. I mean, Drukhari long-range weaponry is at least as good as its Azuyani equivalent, if not better. Things like dark lances and things like that, really devastating long-range weaponry. And if you outfit them correctly and you use them correctly, God, they can do the business. They can take down some very, very big entities very early in the game. If you use them correctly, they can seriously damage things like knights and demon primarchs very early on in the game. Very early on. It just depends on how you deploy them and how you utilize them. But for me, it's not the mechanics that I find the most interesting, it's the background. I love, love, love the way the writers have reimagined them and made them interesting, made them more. That seems to have been the imperative behind the rewrite, the 5th Ed Dark Elder Codex. It was just to make this army come into its own. It was to make it something more than it was, than just being the evil Eldar. No, because that's kind of all they really were at one time. I love it to bits. There's a wonderful sort of surgical Cronenbergian body horror element to them, as there is going to be with anything that involves the homunculi, you know, and tying them to the homunculi is a very clever idea as well. Lending them that affiliation gives them a little bit more flavor. It gives them just a little bit more association within the processes of the Dark City itself. Love it, love it, love it to bits. Scourges, beautiful, beautiful entities and stunning models. Well worth your time. I've actually seen some a lot of Drukhari players, just like Chaos players, go to town with converting their models, because you can with the Drukhari, since they surgically alter themselves and have themselves surgically altered. You can go nuts. And the Scourges give you ample opportunity for that, because they are creations of the homunculi, and you don't think the homunculi are going to take the opportunity to just like tweak and augment and mess about a little bit whilst they're performing the surgery? Of course they are. That's the way they operate. So yes, my loves, there's another wonderful, wonderful unit that I have a lot of time for, an entity within 40k that I have a great amount of enthusiasm for. When we come back, we'll have another little entity or creation to explore. Until then, my dears, bye-bye!